Thanks, Chair. Mr. Jakes, thanks for being here, and to your team for being so readily available for this committee. Mr. Jakes, you outlined in your report about Budget 2025 that $100 billion was misidentified under so-called investment, and that should have been operational expense. Why did you reclassify that $100 billion in your report?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit how we treated capital investment in our issues note. Essentially, we compared the approach of the government, that is a bit broader, that includes a greater type of measures, with an approach that more closely follows other jurisdiction and international standards, that strictly focuses on transaction that directly increase the capital stock, and, like I said, follows definitions from international organization, from the System of National Accounts, from the United Nations. So that kind of extra amount of money would correspond to categories that the government has added to the definition, which can include, tax measures, production subsidies, and others.
Thank you. Now, given that you've reclassified that $100 billion, what does that do to the fiscal anchor of the operational budget that they're saying that they're going to supposedly balance in 3 years?
Well, I think that, like, the one thing we highlighted in a report is that it would make it harder to balance the operating budget if the definition of capital was stricter.
Right. Now, for the people that are watching today, what does that say to the Canadians? Like, what is that, all the stuff that we're talking about right now, not meeting a fiscal anchor or risking it, what does that do to a Canadian's bottom line?
Thanks for the question. I think the bottom line, as we would see it, is it does come back to one of transparency. So whether it's the definition of capital, where the government has come up with a made in Ottawa definition of capital that bears some resemblance to what we've seen in the UK and other jurisdictions, but as we point out, is much broader, or the government is changing, making very substantial changes to fiscal anchors within a relatively short period of time. It really, Parliament and I think Canadians would potentially benefit from a more open and clearer discussion around it.
I fully agree with you. I think that, Mr. Jakes, you brought up the word transparency a lot, whether it's, as you said in your opening statement, that the government within 6 weeks changed its fiscal anchors and the broad definition of capital. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you would like to see that you're not seeing today under this government when it comes to transparency, and what does that say to credibility of this government?
Well, I think, excuse me, we offer one recommendation in the report, and specifically with respect to the definition of capital, that given that the government is now planning on using the operating budget or a balanced operating budget as one of the fiscal anchors, and the linkage between the operating budget and the capital definition, given that they're intrinsically linked, that the government, somebody else should be defining the definition of what capital actually looks like. I think the comparison that I've used in other situations is you need to have a separation of responsibility.
Il faut avoir une séparation des responsabilités. Donc, pour mon fils de 17 ans, ce n'est pas quelqu'un qui arrive avec ses devoirs. Il exécute ses devoirs, il fait ses devoirs, et quelqu'un, après, va mettre une note. Et certainement, quand il est question de la cible capitale, Monsieur Jakes, on a un problème avec l'interprétation.
This channel switched. Have we fixed it? Can we try it again? Can you carry on?
Sure.
Has it corrected itself?
Certainly from our perspective, looking at the previous fiscal anchors, the Government of Canada or the Department of Finance doesn't define debt. That's defined by the Public Sector Accounting Board. It doesn't define GDP. That's something defined by Statistics Canada. And now we moved into territory where the Department of Finance defines what capital is. And they come up with the capital budget, and then they will assess that after the fact and potentially make changes to what the definition of capital is as they see fit. And that's something that we recommend should be changed, consistent with what we see in the UK, where while the UK might have a capital definition, it's set by somebody else, and the assessment is also done by somebody else after the fact. It's simply good practice.
I agree. I think I really appreciate that you highlighted this transparency piece altogether. But I'd like to know from you, what does that do to our credibility when obviously if you're pointing out there's not much transparency, what does it do to Canada's credibility, or how would Canadians take a look at that when it comes to seeing like there's no transparency in the fiscal anchors, as you've highlighted before, or the fact that they've abandoned their debt to GDP ratio?
Well, I would say that by virtue of this committee meeting here today, for parliamentarians to be spending 2 hours on this issue and discussing and debating this issue, I think it certainly speaks to the credibility and confidence that Canadians can have that parliamentarians are paying attention to the issue. From our perspective, there are issues that we've raised that we think are pertinent to parliamentarians that potentially they might want to make changes to them. So, for instance, in the case of the UK and Australia, after an election, a government is legislatively required to actually identify in crystal clear language what the new fiscal anchors are and how they're going to be measured. So that's something that potentially parliamentarians might want to discuss and might see to be worthwhile.
Thank you, Mr. Jenks, and thank you, Mr. Halon. That concludes the time for this round.
Mr. Jacques, in your report, you call for an independent expert body to review or opine on what the government is including in the definition of capital investments. It is surprising, it is shocking that we need an independent body to sort of police the numbers. Can you explain why you felt that we needed this independent expert body?
It goes back to the fundamental principle of separation of responsibilities, which is an accounting concept. And fundamentally, you want to ensure that the people coming up with the budget and then evaluating whether they met the target, that those individuals don't have control over the definitions. So at the midpoint, they can't change the definitions of what falls into those categories.
But apart from a good practice, if the definitions had not been changed and made so broadly and the presentation of the budget had been changed, we wouldn't necessarily be calling for an independent expert body. This is as a result of the changes, of the layers of difficulty that we have in actually understanding what counts as an operating expense and what counts as a capital expense. Is that fair to say?
I would say that is fair, and if this was not related to the government's new fiscal anchor of balancing the operating budget, it would be interesting that the Government of Canada came up and is now defining capital differently than the Accounting Board and Statistics Canada and the United Nations. But it's something that the government could do. They can come up with any language they want to and define things as they see fit. That's their discretion. The moment it entered into the territory of this is our new fiscal anchor and this is how Canadians can judge our performance and this is how we're going to be communicating with parliamentarians, it turned it into an issue, or it turned it into something that certainly requires greater transparency and better controls so parliamentarians can understand it, know what they're looking at, and deliberate over it.
Yeah, I mean, when I read through the budget, I did find that it was very vague. It was not clear what was included as a capital investment and what was excluded from it. I think that the government was intentional in the vagueness, and as a finance professional, I felt that was surprising because it's such an important term, and you would expect it to be actually clearly laid out. So would you say that having an independent expert who determines what counts as capital investments will allow parliamentarians to make more informed decisions when it comes to reporting and scrutinizing the government's expenses?
The short answer is yes, and the longer answer, which you probably don't want, is looking at how changes actually happen to Public Service Accounting Board standards. There is a draft discussion paper that's published months, if not years in advance. It's circulated for comments. Those comments are then collated by the Accounting Standards Board. Then there is a revised draft that is issued for potentially further consultation if there isn't tight consensus. And ultimately, the new standard is implemented with a bit of lead time so everyone can react to it. Certainly in this situation, that's something that could be a good practice, and especially were there to be a change in government or change in Minister of Finance, certainly having transparency around how that Minister of Finance defines capital, it would certainly be something that would be potentially challenging for parliamentarians if there were there to be a new Minister of Finance and the definition was changing without consultation or any of the information being published.
When I speak to my constituents, a lot of them are saying, well, we just want accountability, and they actually welcome this recommendation of an independent expert body so that there is, they feel that the numbers are a little bit more reliable. You sort of take politics out of the numbers. So it was actually welcome based on your report. Have you received any confirmation or assurances from the Prime Minister or the Minister of Finance that they will be adopting this recommendation of an independent expert body?
No.
Thank you. Would you say that this expanded definition of capital investments present the government's fiscal position in a better situation than it actually is?
I would say that it's additional and new information. All of the old information is still there. So debt levels, debt to GDP, deficit to GDP, all those data still exist. The observation that
Thank you, Mr. Jakes. We're going to have to end this round there.
Thank you. I'd like to continue on the topic of credibility. You mentioned in your opening statement that it was only 6 weeks ago that the Prime Minister was insisting that his government's fiscal anchor was a declining debt to GDP ratio, and now it is a declining deficit to GDP ratio, wherein they then change the definition of an operating deficit and claim that is a new fiscal anchor. Can you talk about how changing the goalposts, cutting loose fiscal anchors, and these kinds of inconsistencies affect Canada's fiscal credibility?
Thanks for the question. I would say again it comes back to an issue of the government has full discretion to establish whatever fiscal management practices it wants to, including identifying or potentially changing the fiscal anchors as it sees fit. From our perspective, and looking at good practices across among advanced economies, if you're going to do so, you should do it in a transparent way that brings everyone along with you. So if there are fundamental changes that the government has planned with respect to fiscal management, a good practice would be to explain, these are the changes we're proposing. Does anyone have any feedback? Does everyone understand what these are and what the consequences might be? And then after receiving feedback, potentially putting those into place, incorporating the feedback as you see fit. And that's something that, again, we flag for parliamentarians.
So when an existing fiscal anchor like a declining debt to GDP ratio is so quickly abandoned, how much credibility does the new fiscal anchor have?
I don't know that I'm in a good position to judge that using numbers.
Well, okay. Now with numbers, you did note in your report that there is only, in your estimation, only a 7.5% chance that the government will maintain the anchor that it is now assigned itself. So talk about that, how you arrived at that conclusion, and how that impacts the credibility of the government.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So in terms of measuring the probability of the government respecting its declining deficit to GDP anchor, that's based upon, it's actually using an IMF framework and looking at the historical shocks that have faced the Canadian economy going back over the past 30 years. And when we face those shocks, how severe are they? And in that context, is the government going to be able to still respect those anchors? And again, it's not to say that they can't. And going back to the question around fiscal sustainability, it's not to say that the government is not fiscally sustainable. It is to say that there's a lot less room than there used to be. And the next time there's an economic shock, and there will be, and economic shocks mean recessions, economic shocks can mean pandemics, economic shocks can mean the terrorist attacks of 2001. When those shocks happen, there's far less space, fiscal space, than we had previously.
Right, so they're setting themselves up to have less room to deal with events which we know will happen in the years ahead.
That's correct.
Right. So if a fiscal anchor has only a 7.5% chance of being maintained, is there any purpose in stating an anchor?
I think that's a better question for the Minister of Finance rather than myself.
Right. So there's a 92. Your assessment is there's a 92.5% chance that this government will not maintain this anchor.
That's correct.
Right. So that would, I think, leave one to conclude that there's really not much point, especially since they just cut loose their last anchor when it seemed unlikely that, well, in fact, even their own budget says they will not meet their last anchor. Maybe last question then. So when the finance department decided on its own to change the definition in order to create to then give itself this new anchor with almost no chance of being maintained, they were actually violating the accounting principle of separation of responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. We're going to have to end it there.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Jakes, you identified in your report that the government only has a 7.5% chance of meeting one of their own fiscal targets of a declining deficit to GDP ratio. If they don't meet that ratio, what are the consequences? Like, what happens?
It goes back to, in terms of the consequences, it goes back to potentially questions. It raises questions regarding whether the government, in terms of the government's overall fiscal management strategy. So to the extent to which one has a plan, there are targets within that plan, and those targets aren't being met, it raises the question whether it's the right plan or potentially there needs to be a change in the overall execution. So some of the indicators beyond that specific target in terms of the fiscal anchor, some of the other indicators are obviously the 1 trillion number, so the substantial planned increase in investment within the Canadian economy, as well as a doubling of trade outside of the United States. So those are some other indicators as well.
Would that, suppose they don't meet that target, and would that shake investor confidence, in your opinion?
I don't think I'm well placed to hazard an opinion with respect to the response of financial markets should the government not achieve or meet their fiscal anchors.
Okay, it's fair. You know, when we talk, or when you rightfully said they changed the fiscal anchor after, what, like 30 years from debt to GDP to deficit to GDP. If this government had kept the debt to GDP ratio, do you think their chances to meet that target about it declining would be lower?
Had they decided to, and I always need to be, I won't answer a hypothetical question. That said, mathematically, had they kept it, they would have needed to potentially make different decisions within the budget. Because as we see within the government's own forecast, looking out over the next 10 years, the debt to GDP ratio is increasing. So over a 30-year horizon, it's effectively flat. The previous government had, and previous governments, had a declining debt to GDP ratio over a 5-year horizon. And had the government decided that they wanted to maintain that fiscal anchor, potentially different decisions would have needed to be taken as part of the budget.
The governor of the Bank of Canada was here, and once again, they raised the alarm bells on our productivity and its tie-in with the standards of living and how they're going down for Canadians. I just would like to get your thoughts on what declining in productivity and subsequently the standard of living, what does that mean for Canadians, in your opinion?
Thanks for the question. The productivity is one of the key inputs, both within our medium-term economic forecast, but also as part of our longer-term economic forecast as part of fiscal sustainability. And fiscal sustainability is a lot easier to achieve with a higher productivity rate, higher productivity growth.
Is our productivity a concern to you, though?
Productivity, in comparison to productivity, when you look at it over the past 40 years within Canada, has been declining over time. So it's something that's rightfully seized the attention of both parliamentarians and economists.
This current fiscal situation, what are your thoughts on the current unemployment rate and the youth unemployment rate?
It's certainly something that we pay attention to every month when the labor force statistics are released, and it's certainly something. And again, going back to a question of productivity and also just output within the economy, when there are over 400,000 people between the ages of 15 and 24 who are looking for full-time jobs right now and are searching for them and can't find them, that's a lot of untapped potential across the economy that could potentially boost growth and improve productivity.
What does that say about our current state of our economy?
Well, I think I didn't watch the governor here, but I'm sure going back to a point the governor probably mentioned is there's slack in the economy right now.
Right.
And that slack in the economy, it's a euphemism, but again, you drill down, it gets down to those 400,000 kids between the ages of 15 and 24 who are looking for full-time work who can't find it.
Right. Just a quick question about our GDP per capita. What are your thoughts on it?
Thank you, Mr. Hilon. We're going to have to end there. Thank you.